If Venezuela fires first at a U.S. carrier, this is how it ends. Let me take you back to June 2024, not because it was a particularly dramatic month in the news cycle, but because it was the moment when the pieces on the chessboard were quietly rearranged in ways most people still haven't noticed. On the 12th, the U.S. Southern Command announced the deployment of the USS George Washington Carrier Strike Group to the Caribbean for what was officially described as routine exercises. The Pentagon's press release was careful, almost enhancing regional security, deterring illicit trafficking, demonstrating commitment to partners in the hemisphere. Standard language. Nothing to see here. But here's what they didn't: the George Washington wasn't just any carrier. It was the same ship that had been forward deployed in JA for years, a floating fortress of American power in the Pacific, now suddenly redirected to the doorstep of a country the U.S. has spent the last decade trying to overthrow. And it wasn't alone. Accompanying it were the USS Bataan Amphibious Ready Group, a Marine Expeditionary Unit, and a constellation of surveillance assets, drones, P-8 Poseidon patrol aircraft, and at least one nuclear-powered attack submarine, almost certainly lurking in the deep. This wasn't a routine exercise. This was a full-spectrum show of force, the kind of deployment you see before a war, not during a diplomatic spat. I've spent the last 30 years studying the intersection of military strategy and geopolitics, first as an intelligence analyst, then as a scholar, and now as someone who advises governments on crisis management. And let me tell you, when a superpower moves a carrier strike group into position like this, it's not just posturing. It's a signal. And signals, in international relations, are only as good as the responses they provoke. So let's ask the question no one in Washington wants to: what happens if Venezuela fires first? The official deterrence, democracy, and the rules-based order. If you've been following the mainstream coverage, here's the story you've been: Venezuela is a rogue state, a failed experiment in socialism, a narco-dictatorship run by Nicolas Maduro, a man who stole an election, starved his people, and turned his country into a haven for Russian and Iranian proxies. The U.S., in this telling, is the reluctant hegemon, the global sheriff upholding the rules-based order. The carrier deployment? A necessary measure to deter aggression, protect regional stability, and most importantly, send a message to Moscow and Beijing that the Western Hemisphere remains our sphere of influence. The evidence seems compelling. The 2024 Venezuelan election was widely condemned as fraudulent by the U.S., the EU, and the OAS. Maduro's government has jailed opposition leaders, shut down independent media, and presided over an economic collapse that has driven nearly 8 million Venezuelans into exile. Meanwhile, Venezuela's military ties with Russia have Su-30 fighter jets, S-300 air defense systems, and Wagner Group mercenaries have all been spotted in the country. Iran has supplied drones and ballistic missile technology. China, ever the opportunist, has extended billions in loans secured by Venezuela's oil reserves, effectively turning the country into a client state of Beijing's energy strategy. The U.S. position is Maduro is a threat to regional security, and if he crosses a red line, say, by attacking a U.S. military asset, the response will be swift and overwhelming. The George Washington Strike Group, with its 60-plus aircraft, 5,000 sailors, and accompanying destroyers, is more than enough to turn Caracas into a parking lot if it comes to that. The message is: don't test us. But here's the problem with this: it assumes that Maduro is irrational, that he's a cornered animal who might lash out without calculating the consequences. And that's where the story starts to unravel. Deconstructing the what's really happening in Venezuela. Let's start with the basics. Maduro is not an idiot. He's a survivor. He's outlasted U.S. sanctions, coup attempts, and even a failed mercenary invasion in 2020. He knows the rules of the game. And right now, he's playing a very specific hand. First, the election fraud narrative is more complicated than it seems. Yes, the 2024 vote was flawed, but so were the 2018 elections, and the U.S. still recognized Juan Guaidó as interim president for years, despite his having zero actual control over the country. The reality is that Maduro has consolidated power not just through repression, but through a mix of co-optation, patronage, and sheer exhaustion. The opposition is fractured, the military is loyal, and the population is too busy trying to survive hyperinflation to mount a revolution. The U.S. can call Maduro a dictator all it wants, but the fact is, he's not going anywhere. And deep down, Washington knows this. Second, the idea that Venezuela is a Russian or Iranian puppet is overstated. Yes, Moscow and Tehran have invested in Venezuela, but their influence is transactional, not ideological. Russia sees Venezuela as a useful irritant to the US, a way to force Washington to divide its attention between Europe and Latin America. Iran uses Venezuela as a forward operating base for its proxy networks, but it's not about to start a war with the US over Caracas. China, meanwhile, is playing the long game. It doesn't care about Maduro's politics, it cares about Venezuela's oil. And right now, it's happy to let the US bleed political capital trying to overthrow a government that's already in Beijing's debt. Third, and this is the part no one in the US government wants to admit, Venezuela's military is not the ragtag force it was in the 1990s. Thanks to Russian and Iranian assistance, it now has modern air defenses, anti-ship missiles, and even a rudimentary cyber warfare capability. The George Washington Strike Group is a formidable force, but it's not invincible. A coordinated attack, say, a swarm of Iranian-made drones, a salvo of Russian anti-ship missiles, and a cyber attack on US command and control systems, could inflict serious damage. And that's before we even consider the possibility of asymmetric attacks on US embassies in the region, cyber strikes on American infrastructure, or even the activation of sleeper cells in Miami or Houston. Now, let me be, I'm not saying Venezuela would win a war with the US. That's absurd. But Maduro doesn't need to win. He just needs to make the cost of intervention so high that Washington thinks twice. And that's exactly what he's trying to do. So why is the US deploying a carrier strike group now? The answer has less to do with Venezuela and more to do with the broader geopolitical contest between the US, Russia, and China. The real spheres of influence and the new Cold War. Here's where it gets interesting. The US doesn't actually care about Venezuela's democracy. If it did, it would have done something about Honduras in 2009, or Haiti in 2021, or any number of other countries where elections were stolen and dissidents jailed. No, Venezuela matters because it's a proxy battleground in the new Cold War. Let's rewind to 2019. The Trump administration recognized Guaido as president, imposed crippling sanctions, and even flirted with military intervention. The goal? Regime change. The result? A complete failure. Maduro not only survived, but he deepened his ties with Russia and China. Fast forward to 2024, and the Biden administration is facing it. Do they double down on a failed policy, or do they find a way to cut their losses? The carrier deployment suggests they've chosen the former. But why now? The answer lies in three: multipolarity, deterrence, and Taiwan. First, multipolarity. The US is no longer the sole superpower. China is rising, Russia is resurgent, and the global South is increasingly assertive. The idea that the US can dictate terms to the world is fading. And yet, Washington still operates as if it's 1991. The Monroe Doctrine, the 19th century idea that the Western Hemisphere is America's exclusive domain, is alive and well in the minds of US policymakers. The problem? The rest of the world no longer accepts it. Second, deterrence. The US is trying to send a message to Russia, and we still control our backyard. But this is a dangerous game. If the US overplays its hand in Venezuela, it risks provoking a response from Moscow or Beijing elsewhere, say, in the South China Sea or Eastern Europe. And that's where Taiwan comes in. The US is already stretched thin. It can't afford a two-front crisis. So why take the risk? Because, third, the US is trapped in a paradigm of liberal hegemony, the belief that it can and should remake the world in its image. This has been the guiding principle of American foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. And it's been a disaster. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, all were sold as necessary interventions to spread democracy and stability. All ended in chaos. Venezuela is just the latest chapter in this failed playbook. But here's the: Russia and China are exploiting this. They're not just supporting Maduro out of ideological solidarity. They're doing it because it forces the US to waste resources, political capital, and military bandwidth on a secondary theater. Every dollar the US spends in the Caribbean is a dollar it's not spending in the Indo-Pacific. Every diplomatic crisis in Latin America is a distraction from the real strategic competition with China. And that's the real reason the George Washington is in the Caribbean. It's not about Venezuela. It's about signaling to Beijing that the US can still project power globally. But this is a bluff. And bluffs only work if your opponent believes you're willing to go all in. Military: why a Venezuela-US war would be a disaster. Let's talk about what would actually happen if Venezuela fired first. The most likely scenario is an anti-ship missile attack. Venezuela has acquired Russian-made Kh-35 Orun missiles, which are designed to sink ships. They're not as advanced as China's DF-21D carrier killer, but they're still a threat. If a Venezuelan frigate or coastal battery launched a salvo at the George Washington, the US would respond with overwhelming force. Within minutes, F/A-18 Super Hornets would be in the air, targeting Venezuelan radar sites, missile batteries, and airfields. Tomahawk cruise missiles would rain down on military installations in Caracas, Maracaibo, and Valencia. The Venezuelan Air Force would be wiped out in hours. But here's the: Venezuela wouldn't need to sink the carrier to win. It just needs to damage it enough to force it to withdraw. A single hit on the flight deck could take the George Washington out of action for weeks. And in that time, the political and strategic calculus would shift dramatically. First, the domestic backlash in the US would be immediate. Americans have no appetite for another war, especially not one that starts with a surprise attack on a carrier. The media would frame it as a humiliation, a failure of deterrence. Politicians would demand retaliation, but the public would resist. Remember the Cole bombing in 2000? The US did nothing. Why? Because the American people didn't see it as worth the cost. The same dynamic would play out here. Second, the regional response would be chaotic. Latin America is deeply divided on Venezuela. Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina have all tried to walk a fine line between condemning Maduro and avoiding confrontation with the US. But if the US launched a full-scale attack on Venezuela, those countries would be forced to pick a side. Some would condemn the US, others would support it. The result would be a fractured hemisphere, with the US isolated in its own backyard. Third, Russia and China would seize the opportunity. Moscow would likely increase its military support for Venezuela, perhaps even deploying more Wagner Group mercenaries or offering to mediate the crisis. Beijing would use the chaos to deepen its economic ties, offering Venezuela a lifeline in exchange for even greater control over its oil. And both would use the crisis to argue that the US is a declining power, unable to manage its own neighborhood. Fourth, the military escalation ladder is slippery. If Venezuela launched a missile attack, the US would respond with airstrikes. But what if Venezuela retaliated with cyber attacks on US infrastructure? Or what if it activated sleeper cells in the US to carry out sabotage or assassinations? The US would then face a: do we escalate further, risking a wider war, or do we back down, signaling weakness? This is the nightmare scenario for US military planners. A limited strike could quickly spiral into something much larger. And that's why, despite the bravado in Washington, no one actually wants this fight. The domestic: why Biden can't back down. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the US domestic politics. Joe Biden is in a bind. His approval ratings are underwater, inflation is still a problem, and the border crisis is dominating the news cycle. The last thing he needs is a foreign policy disaster. But here's the: if he doesn't respond forcefully to a Venezuelan attack, he'll be accused of weakness. And in American politics, weakness is the one thing no president can afford. This is where the Florida factor comes in. Florida is a swing state, and its large Venezuelan and Cuban exile communities are a powerful voting bloc. They want regime change in Caracas. They've been pushing for it for years. And if Biden doesn't deliver, they'll punish him in November. But here's the same people who demand a tough response are the ones who would scream the loudest if their sons and daughters were sent to fight in Venezuela. It's a classic case of what political scientists call the interventionist paradox: the public wants action, but it doesn't want to pay the price. Biden's team knows this. That's why they're walking a tightrope. The carrier deployment is meant to deter Maduro without actually starting a war. But deterrence is a delicate balance. If Maduro feels cornered, he might lash out. And if he does, Biden will have no choice but to respond. This is the trap of American foreign policy. The U.S. is so committed to maintaining its global dominance that it can't afford to back down, even when the costs outweigh the benefits. And that's how you get stuck in unwinnable wars. Scenario: how this ends. So, let's game this out. What actually happens if Venezuela fires first? I see three possible scenarios, none of them good. Scenario 1, the limited strike. Venezuela launches a single anti-ship missile at the George Washington, but it's intercepted by the carrier's Aegis defense system. The U.S. responds with a limited airstrike, targeting the missile battery that fired the shot. Maduro, realizing he's in over his head, backs down. The crisis de-escalates. The U.S. declares victory, and the carrier stays in the region as a show of force. This is the best-case scenario, but it's unlikely. Why? Because Maduro isn't stupid. He wouldn't launch a single missile unless he was prepared for a larger confrontation. And if he's prepared, he's not going to back down after one strike. Scenario 2, the escalation spiral. Venezuela launches a coordinated missiles, drones, and cyber strikes. The George Washington is damaged but not sunk. The U.S. responds with a full-scale air campaign, targeting Venezuelan military infrastructure. Maduro retaliates by attacking U.S. embassies in the region and activating sleeper cells. The U.S. then faces a escalate further or negotiate. Given the domestic political pressure, it escalates. The result is a prolonged conflict, with the U.S. bogged down in a quagmire it can't win. This is the most likely scenario. It's also the most dangerous, because it risks drawing in Russia and China. If Moscow or Beijing decide to intervene even indirectly, the conflict could spread. Scenario 3, the regional war. Venezuela's attack is more successful than expected. The George Washington is severely damaged, and hundreds of sailors are killed. The U.S. responds with a full-scale invasion, aiming to overthrow Maduro. But Venezuela's military, backed by Russian and Iranian advisors, puts up a fierce resistance. The U.S. is drawn into a prolonged counterinsurgency campaign. Meanwhile, Cuba and Nicaragua enter the war on Venezuela's side. The result is a regional conflagration, with the U.S. fighting a multi-front war in its own hemisphere. This is the worst-case scenario, but it's not impossible. And if it happens, the U.S. will have no one to blame but itself. The grand strategy why the U.S. keeps losing. Let's out for a moment. The Venezuela crisis isn't just about Venezuela. It's a symptom of a much larger the failure of American grand strategy. For the last 30 years, the U.S. has pursued a policy of liberal hegemony, the idea that it can and should spread democracy, free markets, and American values around the world. This has led to a series of disastrous Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. Each time, the U.S. has overestimated its ability to reshape other countries in its image. Each time, it has underestimated the costs. The result? The U.S. is now overextended. It's trying to contain China in the Indo-Pacific, deter Russia in Europe, and maintain dominance in the Middle East and Latin America. But it doesn't have the resources to do all of this at once. And yet, the foreign policy establishment in Washington refuses to prioritize. Instead, it keeps doubling down on a strategy that's clearly not working. Venezuela is just the latest example. The U.S. could have accepted that Maduro isn't going anywhere and focused on managing the relationship. Instead, it has chosen confrontation, banking on the same tired playbook of sanctions, regime change rhetoric, and the occasional covert operation. The problem isn't that Maduro is a particularly savvy leader, he's not. The problem is that the U.S. keeps assuming that economic pressure and moral condemnation will force a collapse, as if history hasn't repeatedly shown that authoritarian regimes can survive far longer than Western policymakers predict. Look at Cuba, North Korea, Iran. Look at Russia, which has weathered sanctions for a decade and still hasn't buckled. The assumption that Venezuela will be different is either naive or willfully blind. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about ideology. It's about the structural incentives of the US foreign policy machine. There are careers, think tank grants, and defense contracts built on the idea that America must remain the unchallenged hegemon in its own hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine isn't just a historical relic, it's a living, breathing justification for intervention. And when you've spent decades framing Latin America as your backyard, the idea of a hostile government surviving, let alone thriving, becomes an existential threat to the entire worldview. That's why you see figures like Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham, men who have never served in the military but love to talk tough, demanding action. They're not strategists. They're performative hawks whose political fortunes depend on appearing strong, even if their policies make the US weaker in the long run. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela. The real danger isn't just that the US might stumble into a war, it's that every time it overreaches, it erodes its own credibility. Take the 2019 Lima Group Declaration, where the US and its allies recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate president. It was a bold move, but it backfired spectacularly. Guaidó's support collapsed, the military stayed loyal to Maduro, and the US was left looking impotent. Worse, it reinforced the narrative that Washington's interventions are driven by imperial arrogance rather than principle. That's a gift to Russia and China, who can now point to Venezuela as proof that American democracy promotion is just a cover for regime change. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is losing the information war in Latin America, and it's losing it badly. A 2023 Latinobarometro poll found that only 45% of Latin Americans have a favorable view of the US, down from 69% in 2010. Meanwhile, China's approval rating in the region has surged, with 65% of respondents viewing Beijing favorably. That's not because Latin Americans suddenly love authoritarianism, it's because they see China as a reliable partner that doesn't lecture them about human rights while propping up dictators in Saudi Arabia or Egypt. And Russia? It's playing the long game, positioning itself as the anti-imperialist power that will stand up to the US when no one else will. When Maduro survived the 2019 coup attempt, Russian state media didn't just cover it, they framed it as a David versus Goliath victory. That narrative resonates in a region that has suffered centuries of US intervention. So what happens if Venezuela does fire first? The military implications are staggering, but they're not the only thing that matters. The US has two carrier strike groups in the region right now, the George Washington and the Dwight D. Eisenhower. That's a massive show of force, but it's also a massive target. If Venezuela, with Russian or Iranian assistance, manages to land even a single hit on a carrier, the psychological impact would be enormous. The US Navy hasn't lost a carrier in combat since World War II. The idea that a country like Venezuela could inflict that kind of damage would shatter the myth of American invincibility. And in geopolitics, myths matter just as much as missiles. The response would be swift, but it would also be constrained by geography and politics. The US could launch airstrikes, but Venezuela's air defenses, upgraded with Russian S-300 systems, would make that costly. A full-scale invasion? That's where things get messy. Venezuela's military is no match for the US in a conventional war, but it doesn't have to be. It just has to make the cost of occupation unbearable. Look at Iraq, where a ragtag insurgency tied down the most powerful military in the world for nearly 2 decades. Venezuela has terrain that favors guerrilla warfare, dense jungles, urban sprawl, and a population that, while not uniformly pro-Maduro, would likely rally against a foreign invader. And let's not forget the wild Russia and Iran. Moscow has already sent Wagner Group mercenaries to Venezuela in the past. If the US invades, we could see a repeat of Syria, where Russian and Iranian proxies turned a civil war into a quagmire. But the real damage wouldn't be military, it would be strategic. A US invasion of Venezuela would confirm every conspiracy theory about American imperialism. It would drive Latin American countries into the arms of China and Russia. It would make the US look like a bully, not a leader. And it would distract from the real China's rise in the Indo-Pacific. The Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy identified China as the pacing threat, yet here we are, risking a war in our own hemisphere over a country that poses no existential threat to the US. That's not grand strategy, that's strategic malpractice. The establishment will tell you that backing down would embolden adversaries. But the opposite is true. Every time the US overreaches and fails, it emboldens its enemies. Look at Afghanistan. The Taliban didn't just survive, they thrived because the US proved it couldn't win a forever war. The same dynamic is playing out in Venezuela. The longer the US clings to the fantasy of regime change, the stronger Maduro becomes. And the more the US isolates itself, the more space it creates for China and Russia to fill the void. So what's the alternative? It's not pretty, but it's realistic. The US needs to accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere and shift to containment. That means targeted sanctions on human rights abusers, not blanket economic warfare that hurts ordinary Venezuelans. It means working with regional partners like Brazil and Mexico to manage the crisis, not alienating them with unilateral demands. And it means recognizing that the era of unchallenged US dominance in Latin America is over. China is already the top trading partner for most of South America. Russia is selling arms and building alliances. The US can't reverse that trend, but it can stop making it worse. The Venezuela crisis is a test, but not the kind Washington thinks. It's not a test of American power, it's a test of American wisdom. And so far, the US is failing. The question is whether anyone in Washington is paying attention. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Maduro or even Venezuela, it's about the unraveling of the post-Cold War consensus in Washington. For 3 decades, the foreign policy establishment has operated under the assumption that the US can shape the world in its image through a mix of military power, economic coercion, and ideological pressure. But that playbook is breaking down, and Venezuela is the latest case study in why. The problem isn't that the US lacks the capability to overthrow Maduro. The problem is that no one in Washington has asked whether it's worth the cost and, more importantly, whether it's even possible to impose a stable, pro-American government in Caracas after the fact. Let me explain why this matters for domestic politics. The Venezuela issue has become a litmus test in US foreign policy debates, but not in the way you might think. It's not about left versus right, it's about the growing divide between the foreign policy blob and the American public. Poll after poll shows that most Americans, regardless of party, are tired of endless interventions. A 2023 Chicago Council survey found that 70% of Americans oppose using US troops to overthrow foreign governments, even if those governments are hostile to the US. Yet the establishment keeps pushing for exactly that. Why? Because for the think tank crowd, the defense industry, and the career diplomats who've spent their lives in the echo chamber of the Beltway, regime change isn't just a policy, it's an article of faith. Here's the uncomfortable: the people who are most vocal about Venezuela, Marco Rubio, Elliott Abrams, the usual suspects at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, are the same people who got Iraq wrong, Libya wrong, Syria wrong. They're not learning from history, they're repeating it. And they're doing it because it's good for business. The more unstable Venezuela becomes, the more money flows into lobbying firms, the more contracts go to defense contractors, the more op-eds get written about the need for leadership. It's a self-perpetuating cycle, and the American people are the ones footing the bill. But let's talk about what happens if we follow their advice. Suppose Maduro does something reckless, say, firing on a US carrier, as we're discussing. The establishment's response would be a limited strike, maybe a no-fly zone, followed by a push for regime change. But here's the limited strikes don't stay limited. Look at Syria in 2018. The US launched airstrikes after Assad used chemical weapons, and for a moment, it seemed like a clean, proportional response. But then Russia and Iran dug in, the Assad regime survived, and the US found itself stuck in a quagmire with no clear exit strategy. The same dynamic would play out in Venezuela, but with a crucial: Venezuela is in our hemisphere. The political fallout would be immediate and brutal. Imagine that. Now, let's game out the domestic political consequences. If the US launches a strike and it goes badly, say, civilian casualties, or a prolonged insurgency, public opinion would turn sharply against the administration. Remember the backlash after the Benghazi attacks in 2012? That was a minor incident compared to what would happen if a US carrier strike in Venezuela went wrong. The opposition party would use it as a cudgel, and the president's approval ratings would crater. But here's the: it wouldn't just hurt the president. It would hurt the entire foreign policy establishment. The American people would look at the mess in Venezuela and say, "We told you so." And they'd be right. But what if the strike goes well? What if Maduro is toppled quickly and a pro-US government takes over? Even then, the domestic political fallout would be messy. The new government would be weak, dependent on US support, and vulnerable to counter-revolutions. The US would be stuck propping it up for years, just like we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the American public, which has no appetite for another nation-building project, would grow increasingly frustrated. The establishment would declare victory, but the reality would be far more complicated. The US would own Venezuela's problems, and the political cost would be enormous. Here's the establishment doesn't care about any of this. They're not thinking about the long-term consequences because they're not the ones who have to live with them. The people making these decisions, whether it's Rubio in the Senate or Abrams at the State Department, won't be the ones explaining to voters why their sons and daughters are being sent to fight in Caracas. They won't be the ones dealing with the economic fallout if oil prices spike. And they won't be the ones held accountable when the whole thing blows up in their faces. That's the dirty little secret of US foreign: the people who push for these interventions never pay the price for their failures. So what's the alternative? It's not isolationism. It's realism. The US needs to recognize that it can't control every outcome, and that sometimes the best policy is to manage a problem rather than try to solve it. In Venezuela's case, that means accepting that Maduro isn't going anywhere and focusing on containing the fallout. It means working with regional partners to stabilize the country, not alienating them with unilateral demands. And it means recognizing that the US can't afford to be the world's policeman anymore, not when China is rising, Russia is resurgent, and the American public is exhausted. The Venezuela crisis is a test, but not the kind the establishment thinks. It's a test of whether Washington can finally learn from its mistakes. So far, the signs aren't encouraging. The same people who got us into Iraq and Libya are still calling the shots, and they're still pushing the same failed policies. The question is whether anyone in power will listen before it's too late. Because if Venezuela fires first, the establishment will demand action, and the American people will be the ones left holding the bag. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the broader unraveling of American grand strategy. For decades, the US has operated under the assumption that military dominance translates into political control, that overwhelming firepower can shape outcomes in ways that diplomacy and economics cannot. But the world has changed, and the establishment hasn't caught up. The 2003 Iraq War was supposed to be a demonstration of American power; instead, it became a case study in its limits. The 2011 Libya intervention was sold as a humanitarian mission. Today, it's a failed state exporting chaos across North Africa. And yet, here we are again, with the same voices insisting that the solution to Venezuela's collapse is more of the same: more sanctions, more threats, more brinkmanship. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. The US is currently engaged in a global competition with China and Russia, one that is as much about economic influence as it is about military posturing. Beijing understands this. Moscow understands this. The only people who seem not to understand it are the ones in Washington who still think that the answer to every geopolitical problem is a carrier strike group. China isn't trying to outgun the US in the South China Sea, it's trying to outmaneuver it economically, diplomatically, and technologically. Russia isn't trying to match NATO tank for tank, it's exploiting divisions within the West, playing the long game in places like Syria and Africa. And what is the US doing? It's still stuck in the mindset of the 1990s, when unipolarity meant that military force could be wielded with impunity. Here's the uncomfortable: if Venezuela fires first at a US carrier, the establishment will treat it as a casus belli, a moment that demands a decisive response. But the real question isn't whether the US can destroy Venezuela's military; it can, in a matter of days. The question is whether it should. Because the moment the first Tomahawk lands in Caracas, the US will have walked into a trap of its own making. Maduro isn't Saddam Hussein. He's not even Gaddafi. He's a weak leader propped up by a mix of repression, Russian and Chinese support, and sheer desperation. But he's also a leader who knows that the US has no appetite for another long-term occupation. So he'll do what weak leaders backed into a corner always: he'll escalate asymmetrically. He'll arm the colectivos, the pro-government militias that have terrorized Venezuelan cities for years. He'll unleash cyber attacks on US infrastructure, something his allies in Moscow and Tehran have already demonstrated they're capable of. He'll turn the crisis into a regional one, flooding Colombia and Brazil with refugees and destabilizing governments that are already teetering. And that's before we even get to the economic fallout. Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves. The moment US forces move in, global markets will ice. We saw this in 2019 when the Trump administration imposed sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, prices spiked, and the effects rippled through the global economy. Now imagine what happens when the world's largest consumer of oil is suddenly at war with one of its largest suppliers. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve can mitigate some of the damage, but it can't prevent a shock to the system. And in an election year, that's political dynamite. The American public might support a limited strike, but they won't support a protracted conflict that sends gas prices soaring and their 401s crashing. The establishment will spin it as a necessary sacrifice for democracy, but the voters will see it for what it: another foreign policy disaster that hits them where it hurts. So what's the alternative? It starts with recognizing that the US doesn't have to solve every problem to be secure. Venezuela is a tragedy, but it's not an existential threat. The real threats are the ones the establishment keeps: the erosion of American industrial capacity, the hollowing out of the middle class, the decay of infrastructure, the rise of a multipolar world where the US is no longer the sole superpower. The US doesn't need to invade Venezuela to counter China; it needs to invest in its own semiconductor industry, rebuild its supply chains, and compete economically. It doesn't need to overthrow Maduro to counter Russia; it needs to strengthen its alliances in Latin America, support democratic institutions, and offer a viable alternative to the authoritarian model that Moscow and Beijing are peddling. This isn't about isolationism. It's about prioritization. The US spent the last 2 decades fighting wars in the Middle East while China built high-speed rail across Southeast Asia. It's time to stop repeating the same mistakes. The establishment will call this weakness. They'll say it's surrender. But the real weakness is pretending that the US can afford to keep playing the world's policeman when it can't even fix its own bridges. The real surrender is allowing a handful of ideologues in Washington to drag the country into another unwinnable war because they refuse to accept that the world has changed. I've spent years studying these dynamics, and I can tell you the moment Venezuela fires first, the establishment will demand action. They'll say it's about credibility, about deterrence, about standing up to dictators. But credibility isn't built on reckless interventions; it's built on consistency, on strategic patience, on knowing when to act and when to walk away. The US has spent too long confusing motion with progress, and it's time to stop. Because if we don't, the next crisis won't be in Caracas. It'll be in Taiwan, or the Baltics, or somewhere else where the stakes are even higher and where the American people will be even less willing to pay the price. The question isn't whether the US can afford to walk away from Venezuela. The question is whether it can afford not to,